Hello, fourth grade. Today we're going to be working on lesson three. How did lakes and rivers contribute to the industrial growth of the Midwest? And so when we talk about industrial growth, we're talking about factories, we're talking about industries, businesses. And so we're going to be talking about how do lakes and rivers connect to that. Why are they important? Why would we care about them as a resource? And so here we have our photo. Cities in the Midwest, like Detroit, Michigan, grew as more businesses and factories opened. What is special about Detroit, Michigan that would matter here if we're talking about lakes and rivers? What does Detroit have that allows it to be a resource? And so we're going to be describing how the steel and lumber industries were affected by the Great Chicago Fire. We're going to be talking about how iron ore and steel influenced the industry in the Midwest. We're going to be talking about problems that African Americans faced in the early 1900s, looking for different reasons immigrants moved to the Midwest and how they influenced, so they affected the region. And then we're going to be writing a paragraph summarizing the reasons for growth in cities near the Great Lakes. And so down here it says, talk about it. Closer look at the picture. What do you notice about the buildings? What kinds of transportation do you see? Let's go ahead and get started on our reading on our next page, The Great Migration. So we have our inspect portion. It says read, look at the title. What do you think this text will be about? Circle words that you want to learn more about, then underline clues that tell you what the problems were at the time, who had these problems, and how did people try to solve the problems. So you're going to be looking for different issues and how they fixed them, or how they tried to fix them at the very least. Let's go ahead and begin our reading.
Throughout much of the 1900s, laws in the South allowed discrimination against African Americans. For example, African Americans could not go to the same schools as whites or sit near white people in public places. In addition, economic conditions for African Americans in the South were poor due to sharecropping and a struggling farm economy. During World War I, many Americans joined the Army. Northern factories needed workers to help with war production. They placed ads in newspapers in the South looking for workers. Large numbers of African Americans began moving to northern cities to take these jobs and to escape unfair laws. Many African Americans found jobs in northern factories. However, many of the jobs were difficult and unsafe. African Americans also faced discrimination in the North and the West. About 6 million African Americans migrated north and west between 1910 and 1970 looking for a better life. The African American population in Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and New York City grew rapidly between 1910 and 1940. In the 1940s, many African Americans moved to cities in the West, including Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Oakland. This movement of people would change America.
So here we saw that there were a couple of different issues. Of course, there were discrimination laws in the South, but as a result, and the North not necessarily having these same types of laws, but maybe other types of laws that still discriminated, um, a lot of African Americans moved up north. And of course, during World War II, we saw that with a lot of, well, actually, African Americans were not allowed to serve as soldiers or as part of the military until fairly recently. And so during World War One, um, then a lot of American soldiers or a lot of European American soldiers left to go fight in World War One, and then as a result, there were still jobs that needed to be had in order for these cities to function, and so that's why a lot of African Americans moved up north. Yes, they call it the Great Migration, and it's why certain cities you'll notice, if you look at like the information about the history of the cities, you'll notice that there's a huge increase of African Americans or a certain group in those years, of that certain group in those years, because they were allowed to do much more than they were allowed to do in the South. That doesn't mean that it was easier, but it does mean that they had more opportunities to have better lives. Communities could be formed, they had resources, and so all of these different reasons are why people started to, or why African Americans started to move north. And so here we have our caption for our photo. African Americans from the South moved to cities in the North during the Great Migration looking for job opportunities. When it talks about farm sharing or sharecropping, we talked about it in the earlier chapters. And so a lot of times, because they weren't allowed an education or there weren't necessarily resources that they could access for their education, after the Civil War, the Freedmen's Bureau was created, but it quickly wasn't kept up with because a lot of people still, even though the Civil War had already been fought, they thought that African Americans should not receive any sort of benefits from the government, even though the government encouraged slavery or the government used to allowed slavery and caused slavery to exist in the United States. They thought that African Americans should not get help and they should, in some cases, be removed from the United States because they didn't think that they were American because they were not European descent, so they're not from Europe originally, and also because they weren't whites. And so all of these things contributed, so all of these things affected why in the South, when they moved out, or in the South, why uh, there was so much uh, there were so many laws that didn't allow integration, and also because in the South, there were less opportunities because they only wanted them in certain positions. They didn't allow them in lots of different fields, and so they tried to move north to get more opportunities. You can go ahead and underline problems African Americans faced, and then reread which words help you identify the problems that African Americans were having. Then we're going to go through our workbook page. And so here we're looking at problems and solutions. We've already talked about problems that they were facing. And so now we're going to be continuing that. Text can be structured around a problem and the solution to that problem. The beginning of the text will describe the problem. The text that follows will describe a solution. So usually before is the problem, afterwards a solution. The solution can be something that has already fixed the problem or something the writer is proposing, so suggesting could fix the problem. To understand problem and solution, read through the text all the way, and this will help you understand what the text is about. Look for an issue or problem being described. What problem did we notice on the other page? And some keywords that might tell you are things like challenge or struggle. Those are your code words that tell you we're going to be reading about something like that. Then our third step is to identify how the issue is resolved or fixed or the challenge is overcome. What did the person or group of people who are facing the challenge do to deal with the problem or defeat it? And if it wasn't, then what were they doing to fix it, to try to fix it? Then for number 4, find a relationship between the solution and the problem. Ask yourself if the people's actions solve the problem described in the beginning. So here we have a who, and the African Americans are the who living in the South. The problem we saw was that in the South there was a lot of discrimination that was legal, and in the North there wasn't as much legalized discrimination because the northern states didn't specifically have slavery. They didn't allow slavery, but there was still other forms of discrimination that they just didn't necessarily say or write. So the main issue that they had is that in the South they faced legalized discrimination. And then the solution to that was that many African Americans began moving north to find better jobs and escape the unfair laws. And so now we're going to be reading page 204 to 213, and we're going to be looking for different who's. So here we have who being the people of Chicago in 1871. We're going to see what problem they had and then a solution. And then you're going to put 3 more groups here, and then you're going to put their 3 problems and then their solutions after that. So we're now on page 204 on our textbook page. We see here from our timeline that in 1871, the Great Chicago Fire destroys much of the city. Here we have the city of Chicago. Then in 1904, the Model T Ford automobile is introduced. So the Ford was one of the first people to introduce cars affordable for the average person. Then in 1914, the first traffic light is installed in Cleveland, Ohio. In 1916, the Great Migration begins. So let's go ahead. It says cities located on the Great Lakes, such as Detroit, Michigan, trade with the rest of the world. How do they access the rest of the world? So we're looking at waterways of the Midwest. And how did lakes and rivers contribute to the industrial growth of the Midwest?
The Northwest Ordinance provided a method of organizing the lands known as the Northwest Territory. As settlers moved to and developed this area, they formed the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Located near large lakes, this area came to be known as the Great Lakes region. There are 5 Great Lakes: Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario. These 5 lakes represent the largest surface area of fresh water in the world. 8 states in the United States border the Great Lakes. Canada borders the Great Lakes to the north. The Great Lakes provide access to the oceans for many inland cities. They were first connected to the Atlantic Ocean by the Erie Canal. Now, the St. Lawrence Seaway connects the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. Canals and rivers connect the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Because of this water access, cities along the Great Lakes can trade with other parts of the world. Cities located on the Great Lakes rapidly grew as trade and industry helped bring people and jobs to the region.
So as we're reading through it, if you notice anything that might be something that you can fill in, because we just talked about the Great Lakes and how they're the waterways that connect to the rest of the world. If you notice that there's something that you can use to fill in your graphic organizer, you can go ahead and start filling it in.
Some cities in the Midwest started as fur trading posts. As these posts grew, the United States wanted to protect these areas. The government began building forts to protect these growing towns and cities. In the early 1800s, Fort Dearborn was built to protect the trading post that would become the city of Chicago. In Ohio, the government built Fort Industry to protect the area that would become the city of Toledo. In the mid-1800s, the cities located on the Great Lakes grew, thanks to the access to resources and water. Farmers shipped their crops. Loggers shipped lumber. Miners shipped iron ore. People wanted faster, more direct ways to ship goods. As a result, canals were built to connect major waterways. In 1848, the Illinois and Michigan Canal was completed in Illinois. This canal helped to directly link Lake Michigan with the Mississippi River. This also shifted the center of trade in the Midwest from St. Louis to Chicago. As trade along the waterways increased, cities on the Great Lakes and connecting rivers began to boom. People moved to these cities because of the jobs that were available there. For example, Chicago became one of the world's busiest lumber ports in the 1870s. In 1870, most of the buildings in Chicago were built of wood. There were even wooden sidewalks. On October 8, 1871, a fire broke out on the southwest side of the city. Because so much of the city was made of wood, the fire spread quickly. The Great Chicago Fire burned for more than 24 hours and ruined a section of the city that was about 4 miles long and 1 mile wide. The fire killed hundreds of people. The rebuilding of the city was called the Great Rebuilding. Chicago's builders rebuilt many structures using steel rather than wood. Steel is made from iron ore. This change helped protect the city against huge fires. The demand for steel also helped the iron ore industry to grow.
All right, so using our information, we see that there are different benefits, or there were different things that were affecting the people of Chicago at the time. And so down here we have the caption, factories were built in the Midwest, often along rivers and Great Lakes. And here we have the caption for our painting, the Chicago Fire, and this is what Chicago looks like now. You notice there's a gigantic river going through it, that's the Chicago River. And so we have the river connecting us to the Great Lakes, or connecting them to the Great Lakes. And so if you wanted to talk about how, for the people of Chicago, with their problem being buildings and sidewalks were mainly made of wood, this allowed a fire to be easily spread. And then later, when the fire did spread, it destroyed most of the city. And then their solution was, after the fire, they rebuilt it using steel. Let's go ahead and continue to our next pages for the steel industry and the auto industry.
Iron ore was discovered in Michigan in 1844. The iron industry first grew because of the railroads. Iron ore was used to make train engine cars and rails. It was mined and shipped to places like Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland. A new process for making steel was developed in the 1880s. This steel was lighter and easier to make. As a result, steel became more affordable. Since it was lighter, it was easier to use to construct buildings and bridges. Steel made it possible to construct tall buildings, called skyscrapers. The first skyscrapers were 10 to 20 stories tall. Steel was also used to build major bridges over the Ohio River and Mississippi River. This new demand for steel led to the building of steel plants along the Great Lakes. The city of Gary, Indiana, was built because of the growth of the steel industry. People came to Gary, Indiana, because of the jobs available there. In 1914, World War I started. As the United States prepared for war, the need for steel increased. This created jobs for people to make weapons and equipment needed for the war.
And so we see how steel had a huge impact on the growth of cities. We saw, of course, with Chicago, we saw how it affected the war, at least during World War I. And of course, now a lot of things we have are made out of steel. At the time, it was using more iron based. And so steel does use iron, but now we mix it in with different metals in order to make it lighter because iron is a heavy ore. Let's go ahead and continue to the auto industry.
In 1903, Henry Ford started the Ford Motor Company in Michigan. In 1908, the company built an automobile called the Model T. Ford used an assembly line to make his automobiles. Workers assembled the same part of each automobile as it reached their spot on the assembly line. This allowed for the mass production of automobiles, which means that a lot of automobiles could be built in a short amount of time. Ford paid his workers well. Many were able to buy an automobile like those they were making. This was one of the reasons why people wanted to work at the Ford Motor Company. Working conditions were not great in all factories, though. Many workers faced problems in their jobs. In response, workers joined together to form unions. Unions are groups of workers who fight for fair pay and safe working conditions. Other automobile companies opened manufacturing plants in Michigan in the early 1900s. As a result, Detroit became known as the Motor City.
So now we see how steel affected the auto industry. Down here we have our caption, Henry Ford used the assembly line for manufacturing automobiles. We've talked about manufacturing using an assembly line. So that means each person in that line has a different job. And so rather than one person making everything, they take turns. They'll just pass it along, just complete that portion. And so down here we have the steel industry grew in the Midwest cities like Gary, Indiana. Now we have the Great Migration. And so the caption on the bottom, African Americans moved north during the Great Migration.
World War I began in Europe in 1914. Initially, the United States did not join the war, but companies did begin to produce war supplies. Factories needed workers to make these supplies. Beginning in 1916, many African Americans who lived in the South began moving north for these jobs. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, many men went off to war. This left factories in need of more workers. Factories in the North placed ads in newspapers and magazines to attract workers. As a result, African Americans moved from the South to northern cities, such as Chicago, New York, and Detroit. They traveled by boat, railroad, and car. This movement of people was known as the Great Migration. African Americans also moved to escape discrimination, segregation, and violent attacks against them in the South. Even though many African Americans found jobs in the North, They often faced discrimination and poor working conditions. Many were not welcomed in established neighborhoods. The African Americans who came added to the culture in northern cities. Some wrote books and poems about what it was like to be an African American in the United States. They built churches and opened restaurants. As a result, northern cities along the Great Lakes became more diverse.
Let's go ahead and continue with our biography, Garrett Morgan. And so Garrett Morgan created many important inventions. We have as our caption. Garrett Morgan was an inventor. He was born in Kentucky in 1877. When he was a teenager, Morgan moved to Ohio to look for work. He had several jobs at sewing factories. Through those jobs, he learned how to fix sewing machines. He invented a way to improve sewing machines and opened his own sewing machine repair business. In 1914, Morgan invented a breathing device that was a safety hood. It allowed people to breathe when covered in smoke. Because Morgan was an African American person, people hesitated to buy it, buy it. Morgan hired a white person to help him sell his product. Once people saw how his invention worked, they realized its benefits. Morgan's invention protected soldiers from poisonous gases in World War I. Firefighters and rescue workers also used it. In 1916, an explosion in a tunnel in Cleveland trapped workers underground near gas fumes. Morgan and others used his breathing device to save 2 workers. Surprisingly, this rescue hurt sales of the breathing device. Following this event, many people learned that Morgan was African American. Some people refused to buy the device because he was African American, so they were discriminating against him. Morgan was the first African American in Cleveland to own an automobile. After seeing a car accident, he thought of an idea to help traffic flow. He invented a traffic signal that was an early form of the modern-day traffic signal. So modern traffic lights around the world are based on Garrett Morgan's invention. Let's go ahead and continue to our next pages. For our last 2 pages, 212 and 213. Immigration and the Midwest.
Over time, many immigrants from Europe moved to the United States. Some left their home countries to escape bad situations. Others came to the United States in the hopes of finding a job. Immigrants settled in Midwest cities such as Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, and Milwaukee. They took jobs in the steel industry, auto industry, and other factories. Many immigrants helped build major railroads, canals, and bridges. When immigrants arrived in cities, they often moved into neighborhoods with other people who spoke the same language. Often, immigrants faced discrimination. They worked difficult or dangerous jobs for low pay. Eventually, immigrants were able to join labor unions to help improve their working conditions. Immigrants often struggled when they came to the United States. Being so far from home and not knowing the English language was difficult. Some Americans, like Jane Addams, worked to help immigrants. Addams created Hull House in Chicago to help immigrants succeed. Workers at Hull House watched children while their parents went to work. At Hull House, immigrants learned English and other skills.
And we have our caption here. Some immigrants were able to take English classes at the factories where they worked. So sometimes it was provided by their job, and other times they had other organizations that allowed them to gain those resources. And then we have influence of immigrants on our next page.
Large groups of immigrants with similar traditions moved to the same areas. For example, many Germans moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Because of this, Milwaukee is a place that has a lot of German foods and cultural influences. Many people from Norway and Sweden moved to Minnesota. Scandinavian traditions from that part of the world are still common today in Minnesota. In the 1980s, many people from Vietnam began migrating to Minneapolis, Minnesota. In recent times, large groups of immigrants from Central America, South America, and Africa have moved to Midwest cities. Large cities offer a diverse range of cultures for people to experience. Immigrants today can still face discrimination or struggle to adapt to the new language and culture. However, other immigrants find success in their new country. People can usually find a place to celebrate the traditions of their home countries to keep their heritage alive.
And so now that we finished reading our textbook pages, you can go ahead and read the caption. Many buildings in Minnesota have a Scandinavian style architecture, and Detroit, Michigan has a thriving Muslim community. Let's go ahead and go back to our workbook pages. So if you saw any other problems, for example, talking about our factory workers, you saw that they had poor working conditions and they were paid very low. Maybe you wanted to talk about how the solution to that was that they formed unions in order to fight for, better working conditions. Because obviously, if they're in dangerous situations, they're not going to stay at that job, but they also might not have much of a choice if all the factories are doing the same thing to them. So they have to work together. Maybe you want to talk about Garrett Morgan and how people couldn't breathe when they were surrounded by smoke. So he created a safety device to help people breathe. Or maybe you want to talk about how he made the modern invention or the early invention for traffic lights. Maybe you want to talk about how immigrants in Chicago struggled to adapt to a life in this country. And if they did struggle, then what were some ways that they solved it? Well, they had help from places like Hull House. Maybe their jobs gave them resources in order to thrive inside the United States. So all of these things are who, our problems, and our solutions. Let's go ahead and move to our next page. So review your research based on your information you've gathered. Why did people move to cities near the Great Lakes? And so before you begin, start thinking, what are the Great Lakes? Well, we know that we have our 5 main lakes, and they are connected to the Atlantic Ocean using rivers and canals. And you can go ahead and list the five Great Lakes, and they represent the largest surface area of fresh water in the world, as in they're not salty. So their water is drinkable as long as it's not polluted. Then, for our right and cite evidence, why did different people move to cities near the Great Lakes? And we're going to be using facts from the text to explain our response. Well, we saw that different groups moved to the Great Lakes because there were lots of opportunities, lots of jobs, lots of resources. Maybe they were there because it's easy to travel to get there versus traveling by land. Maybe they came by boat. And then we see that there were lots of opportunities in factories. There was lots of businesses there. For example, African Americans were being hired in the North, especially in those areas, because of World War I, and because they knew that a lot of African Americans wanted these jobs and would be willing to almost put themselves in danger because they knew that in the South it was more dangerous. And so sometimes it was because there were bad situations in wherever they were from. Maybe it was from their own country. Maybe it was from the southern part of the United States. Maybe it was because of discrimination. So all of those things are reasons that we can show from our text that connect to why people moved to the area around the Great Lakes. And then are connected to the essential question, name 3 ways the growth of cities in the Midwest reflects the spirit of America. So we've been talking about how the United States, or specifically the Midwest, is the spirit of America because we've seen how portions of the United States, especially for the Midwest, we went through it. We took land there. We had access to different resources. We were able to change the situations there, able to make use of different environments. And then from there, now we still use it actively today. And so name 3 ways the growth of cities in the Midwest reflect the spirit of America. Maybe you want to talk about how lots of inventions came from that area, or how there was lots of industrial development because there was city growth. You saw that the steel industry started growing from there, especially after iron was discovered in that area. Maybe you want to talk about how for a lot of people, it was the source of where immigrants came from or came to in order to gain access to different opportunities that might not have been everywhere else at the time. And so as it's developing, as it's starting to accept more people, it's starting to get better and it's starting to show, especially for the rest of the United States, that all of these things are connected. All right, and then we have, if you wanted to talk about how Chicago rebuilt itself after the fire, or if you want to talk about how people started working together in order to fight for better working conditions. All of these things are ways that the growth of cities in the Midwest show the spirit of the US because it is showing how, despite how it started, now it's trying to get better. So despite all of the problems that it was facing, it is trying to actively work to improve itself. And that can connect to how the United States is till now, that we have, while we might have a lot of problems, or we might have had a lot of problems, we're still actively trying to fix them. All right, that is the end of this video lesson. So go ahead and go through all of your answers. Make sure that they are neat. Make sure you have complete sentences. Make sure that you have your name and date on all of your pages, and then upload it to Google Classroom. If you're not sure about any of it, go ahead and leave a comment, and then I will get back to you on there. And I will see you in our next video.